The rain had been falling on the gravel drive since dawn, and by noon it had settled into the kind of steady gray drizzle that seeped through wool and settled into bone. Inside the great hall of the estate, where dust motes usually drifted undisturbed through shafts of amber light, some 40 men and women now stood shoulder to shoulder, their damp cloaks steaming faintly in the cold air, their breath visible each time they spoke. She stood near the back, where the light from the tall windows barely reached, her boots still carrying the red clay of the northern fields she had walked that very morning before the sun rose. Her gloves were mended at the fingers. Her bonnet had seen 4 winters. She held her father's leather ledger against her chest, the way another woman might hold a child. At the front of the room, beside the auctioneer's table, stood the trustee, a man whose coat had never known rain, whose watch chain caught the candlelight with a small, deliberate gleam each time he moved his hand. He had the particular stillness of a man accustomed to being obeyed before he finished speaking. £300, the auctioneer called, and a murmur passed through the room like wind through dry grass. She lifted her chin, not her hand, and said clearly, 320. The room turned toward her, as one body turns toward an unexpected sound. Someone laughed, briefly, and was silenced by a look from the auctioneer. The trustee did not laugh. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a smudge on an otherwise clean window, with faint, tired distaste. "Miss Ferrars," he said, and something in the careful courtesy of her name made it sound like an accusation. "I confess, I did not realize we had opened the bidding to jest." A few chuckles, quickly swallowed. "I have not jested, sir," she said. £320, he said slowly, as though tasting something bitter, for a house with 60 rooms, 400 acres, and a lineage older than the crown itself. "I might call it an insult to a great house, Miss Ferrars, were I not certain you meant no insult, only that you had not troubled to understand what you were bidding on." The words landed the way a slap lands, not loud, but precise, and lingering long after the sound had faded. Several heads turned to see how she would receive it. She did not flush. She did not look away. She only opened her father's ledger, very slightly, so that the corner of a hand-drawn map showed above the leather binding, and said nothing at all. It was, the older women in the room would later agree, a very particular kind of silence. The silence of someone who knows something the room does not, and has decided, for now, to let the room go on thinking otherwise. Outside, the rain continued, indifferent to fortunes being decided within. The auctioneer, a man of perhaps 60 years with spectacles perpetually sliding down the bridge of his nose, cleared his throat in the particular way that meant business must proceed, regardless of what feelings had just been trampled underfoot. He had known her father, had, in fact, purchased from him 30 years prior a small parcel of marshland that had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to drain beautifully and grow the finest barley in the parish. He remembered the man's hands, permanently ink-stained, and the way he had spoken of soil composition the way other men spoke of horses or wives. He looked now at the daughter and saw something of the father in the set of her jaw, though he could not have said precisely what. "The bid stands at £320, he said. "Do I hear 350? A gentleman near the back, heavy-set, red-faced, dressed in the particular shade of green favored by men who had recently discovered money and wished everyone to know it, raised his hand and named the sum without troubling to stand. He did not look at her at all. She was, to him, an inconvenience already dismissed, a minor obstacle in the shape of a woman who would surely retreat once real money entered the room. She did not retreat. 380, she said, and this time several people did not merely turn, but stared outright, for there was something in her voice that had not been present before. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of settled patience, the patience of a woman watching other people guess at a sum she had already calculated to the shilling. The trustee's mouth tightened. He had not expected the number to climb. He had expected, if he was honest with himself in the brief moment he allowed for honesty, that she would bid once, be humiliated, and withdraw to wherever surveyors' daughters withdrew to, when great houses prove too great for them. He glanced toward a man seated near the window, unremarkable in dress, careful in posture, the sort of man who attends auctions on behalf of someone else and takes pains not to be noticed doing so. The man in green raised his hand again. 400. She matched it within the space of a breath and did not blink. Outside, the rain had thickened into something more deliberate, drumming against the tall windows with the patience of water that has all afternoon to fall. Inside, the ledger remained open at her elbow, its map still showing that single corner of hand-drawn ink, and though no one else in the room could have said what it depicted, she alone knew that the northern field, dismissed by every man present as poor rocky pasture, held beneath its thin soil something none of them had troubled to ask her father about while he lived. Blackwood's mouth performed the small motion it always did before he spoke, a tightening at one corner, as though he were folding a piece of paper before tearing it. 420, he said, though he had not raised the estate's stated reserve, nor indeed been asked. It was not a bid but a suggestion of scale, offered to remind the room what sums of money were meant to sound like in this house. She did not answer him. She answered the auctioneer instead, her voice pitched no louder than necessary to be heard over the rain, and named a figure that made the man in green turn his head, briefly, to see who owned it. The auctioneer, a spare man with ink-stained cuffs, who had known her father across 2 decades of boundary disputes and tithe surveys, wrote the number down without comment, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was enjoying the morning rather more than propriety strictly allowed. He had buried her father in April. He remembered the funeral had been thinly attended, a surveyor's death draws few carriages, and remembered, too, that she had stood at the graveside in a borrowed black bonnet, and not wept where anyone could see her do it. A murmur passed along the second row, where 3 gentlemen of the county sat with the particular stillness of men, recalculating their interest. One of them, heavier in the face than in the purse, leaned toward his neighbor and asked, in a whisper not nearly quiet enough, whether the girl meant to bid the place into ruin out of some misplaced sentiment for her father's old surveys. His neighbor did not answer. He was watching her hands instead, which lay flat and unmoving on the table's edge, betraying nothing. Not triumph, not nerves, not the arithmetic she was surely running behind a face schooled into stillness by years of watching her father calculate risk for other men's land, while denying himself the comfort of showing his own worry. Blackwood's pen had stopped moving across his ledger. He was a man accustomed to rooms bending around the shape of his silences, and this room was declining to bend. He looked once more toward the man near the window, who gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet, the gesture said, though whether it meant patience or alarm, no one but the 2 of them could have said with certainty. The rain did not relent. It had settled now into the steady, indifferent rhythm of weather that intends to outlast whatever businessmen conduct beneath its sound, and beneath that sound, the bidding climbed again, number folding over number, while she sat with the ledger's ink-drawn corner turned discreetly toward her own knee, where no curious eye could yet read what she had already spent 4 years learning to read herself. The auctioneer called the figure again, and this time his voice carried a note she recognized from years of watching her father transact business in rooms much like this one, the particular weariness of a man who has said the same words too many times to too many people who did not deserve the courtesy of his patience. He was old enough to remember when the estate's northern boundary had been disputed by a hedgerow and a dead man's memory, and old enough, too, to remember whose daughter sat before him now with her hands folded like a woman at prayer, rather than a woman at war. She raised the figure again. It was not a large sum, measured against what the wealthier men in the room commanded without troubling to open their coats against the damp, but it was exact, precise to the shilling, as though she had arrived already knowing the sum she would need before she needed it, which was, in fact, the truth of the matter, though no one in the room could have guessed how long she had carried that number folded inside her, the way a woman might carry a letter she does not yet intend to send. The man near the window shifted his weight from one boot to the other. It was a small motion, barely worth remarking, except that Blackwood's eyes flicked toward it the instant it happened, and in that flick she read something she had not expected to find in him. Not cruelty exactly, but the particular strain of a man managing an anxiety that was not entirely his own. He had called her bid an insult not 10 minutes before. Now he watched the room the way a creditor watches weather, calculating what it might cost him before it broke. Someone coughed. The rain thickened against the high windows, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting for the next figure to be spoken, waiting to see whether the daughter of a dead surveyor would fold before the men who had never once walked the ground they meant to purchase. She did not fold. She named a sum that made the clerk beside the auctioneer pause with his pen lifted an inch above the page, as though the ink itself required a moment to decide whether it believed her. It was more than any figure she had spoken yet, and it came from her without hesitation, without the small betraying breath that so often precedes a number a person cannot truly afford. She had learned that stillness from her father, who had gone to his grave believing that hesitation was a debt paid twice, once in coin, once in dignity. Blackwood set down his pen entirely. "Miss Ferrars," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier warmth of contempt, replaced by something colder and more careful. "You understand what you are claiming to hold." "I understand," she said, "precisely what I am claiming." He had not expected her to answer so plainly, and something in his composure shifted, the way a man's face shifts when he has misjudged the depth of water before stepping into it. He did not step back. Men of his sort rarely did, even when the ground gave way beneath them. Instead, he turned his attention to the auctioneer, a broad, weathered man with ink-stained cuffs and a face that had known her father's for 30 years, and he asked, in a tone meant to sound like procedure rather than desperation, whether the room might pause to confirm the standing of the bidder. "Confirm what, precisely?" the auctioneer said, not looking up from his ledger. "Her circumstances," Blackwood said, "her means, her standing to hold property of this nature." The word standing fell into the room like a stone into still water, and she felt its ripples move through the gathered men before she saw them, the way one feels weather before it arrives. She kept her hands folded before her, the leather notebook pressed flat beneath her palm, and she did not allow her eyes to move toward the window, though the rain had grown loud enough now to seem almost deliberate, as though the sky itself wished to be consulted. The auctioneer set down his pen with the same unhurried care her father used to bring to closing a survey book at the end of a long day's walking. "The law asks for coin and character," he said. "It does not ask for a husband's name on the deed, Mr. Blackwood. Whatever your client may prefer." He said the word client. The way a man says a thing he has decided not to pursue further in company. "Miss Ferrars's father surveyed this land for 30 years. I have known her longer than I have known you. Her bid stands until another exceeds it." A murmur passed through the room, not unkind, though not yet warm. The sound of men recalculating something they had assumed settled. She felt, rather than saw, the shift of attention toward her, felt the particular weight of being looked at by those who had, moments before, looked past her entirely. It was not triumph she allowed herself to feel. Triumph, her father had always said, was for men with time to spare on feeling things twice. Blackwood's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that the ground had indeed given way somewhere beneath his careful arithmetic. He did not look toward her again immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the door at the rear of the hall, toward the gray rectangle of afternoon where the carriages waited, as though calculating how long a letter might take to reach whoever waited, unseen, on the other end of his instructions. The auctioneer lifted his gavel an inch, not yet to strike, only to ask, in the voice of a man performing a duty he had performed 1,000 times and would perform 1,000 more, whether any other figure would be offered before the bidding closed. The room, for the second time that afternoon, said nothing at all. The silence held its shape a moment longer, and into it walked the memory she had not summoned, though it came anyway, the way certain memories do, arriving unbidden at the exact moment the mind has no room for them. Her father, 11 years gone now, kneeling in the wet grass of the northern field with his surveying rod planted like a lance, his coat soaked through at the shoulders, saying to her, 9 years old and holding the chain steady with both hands because he had asked her to, not because she was strong enough, that the ground never lied, only the men who sold it did. She had not thought of that sentence in years. She thought of it now with the particular clarity of cold water, and understood, in the space of that single breath, why her hand had not trembled when she raised it. The auctioneer's gavel remained lifted, patient, a small brass moon suspended above the block. He was watching her with an attention that had nothing to do with the sale, and everything to do with the daughter of a man he had once shared a pipe with on a Tuesday evening 30 years past, before her father's eyes had failed, and his ledger had thinned, and the two of them had drifted, as men do, into separate corners of a shrinking world. She did not know all of this. She knew only that his gaze held something steadier than curiosity, and that it did not waver even as Blackwood, behind her now, cleared his throat in a manner clearly intended to be heard. "Perhaps," Blackwood said, addressing the auctioneer rather than her, as though she were a clause in a document rather than a woman standing 4 feet from him, "the gentleman's counsel would wish a moment to confer with his principals before the hall commits itself further." "There is no gentleman bidding at present," the auctioneer replied, not unkindly, laying the words down flat as coins on a counter. "There is a bid, and it stands, until another is offered." A murmur passed through the gathered coats and bonnets. Not laughter, not yet, but the low current beneath laughter, the sound of a room deciding how it wished to remember this. She kept her eyes on the block, on the worn brass fittings of the gavel, on anything that was not a face, because faces at such moments asked questions she had no wish to answer aloud. Somewhere near the back a chair creaked. Somewhere nearer, Blackwood's breathing had gone shallow and controlled, the breathing of a man rehearsing his next sentence before he permitted himself to speak it. He did not speak it yet. The auctioneer waited. The rain, which had been threatening the windows all afternoon, finally began. The rain came first as a suggestion, a scattering of drops flung sideways against the tall windows, and then as a fact, a steady drumming that filled the silences the auctioneer had been leaving on purpose. She felt it more than heard it, felt the way the room's attention divided itself between the block and the weather, grateful, perhaps, for something else to look at. A woman 2 rows back opened a fan, though the hall had grown no warmer, only to have somewhere to put her hands. The trustee did not move. He stood with his gloved fingers curled around the head of his walking stick, as though it were the only steady thing left to him, and his eyes, when they found her at last, held not anger, but a kind of arithmetic, the look of a man recalculating a sum he had believed settled. She thought of her father then, though she had not meant to, thought of the particular way he used to stand at the edge of a field before he measured it, letting his eyes travel the whole shape of the land before he ever set the rod down. He had told her once that a boundary was not a line but an argument, and that the surveyor's task was only to write down who had won it for now. She had not understood him at the time. She understood him now, standing in a room full of men who had never walked the northern acres in November, who did not know that the ground there rang faintly hollow underfoot if one knew to listen for it. The auctioneer's hand moved toward the gavel and stopped, not from indecision, but from habit, the pause of a man who had done this work for 30 years and trusted his pauses more than his instincts. "The bid stands," he said again, more to the room than to her, "at £410. He let it settle. Somewhere a gentleman in a wet greatcoat murmured a figure to his neighbor, and the neighbor shook his head, and neither of them raised a hand. Blackwood shifted his weight, and for the first time that afternoon, something in his composure seemed to cost him effort to maintain. He glanced once toward the door at the back of the hall, as if expecting it to open on someone who had not yet arrived, someone whose absence he was beginning, visibly, to resent. No one came through it. The rain went on. She did not smile. She had learned long ago that a smile at such a moment would be read as triumph, and triumph, in a room like this, was a debt that came due later, with interest. She only lifted her chin a fraction, the way her father used to when a client questioned his figures, and waited, as he had taught her, for the silence to do its work before she spoke into it again. The auctioneer's clerk, a boy of perhaps 14, with ink-stained fingers and a cold sore forming at the corner of his mouth, dipped his pen and waited, as everyone else waited, for the room to decide what it wished to become. It was in this pause, this particular silence, thick with wet wool and the smell of tallow candles burning low in their sconces, that she allowed herself to think, briefly, of the survey book at home, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, its pages soft as cloth from handling. She thought of the northern field and the gray seam of stone that ran beneath it, like a vein beneath skin, visible only to someone who had walked that ground in February mud and August drought both, who had watched the color of the grass change where the rock lay close beneath the surface, who had asked her father why, and had been told, patiently, the way he told her everything, until she understood it as her own knowledge and not merely his. She raised her hand. 430, she said, and her voice did not shake, though the room seemed to draw breath around her, as if she had struck something. Blackwood turned his head slowly, the way a man turns when he does not wish to be seen to hurry. "Miss Ferrars," he said, and this time there was no courtesy left in the syllables of her name, only a kind of weary contempt, as though she were a debt he had assumed he would not have to pay. "You will forgive me if I wonder where a surveyor's daughter comes by such sums, between one breath and the next." "You may wonder as you like, sir," she said. "The money is not yours to account for." A ripple went through the gathered men, not quite laughter, something closer to the sound a room makes when it recognizes, against its will, that it is watching something rare. The auctioneer's mouth, beneath its gray mustache, twitched, whether in warning or approval she could not tell, and did not look long enough to decide. He called the figure again, into the rafters, into the rain-loud silence, and this time no one murmured to his neighbor. The gentleman in the wet greatcoat folded his hands, and did not raise them again. Blackwood's gaze went once more to the door at the back of the hall, and this time he did not disguise the flicker of something like fear crossing beneath his composure, quick as a fish beneath dark water, gone before anyone could be certain they had seen it at all. She did not watch him. She watched the auctioneer's gavel, resting on its worn wooden block, and thought of her father's hand closing around a similar tool of measurement, and understood, with a calm that surprised even her, that whatever came through that door now would come too late to matter. The gavel did not fall at once. The auctioneer let the silence stretch, as though testing its weight, as though he too understood that some moments in a room must be allowed to finish breathing before they are closed. Rain kept its steady percussion on the high windows, and somewhere behind her a chair scraped against stone, and a man cleared his throat with the particular delicacy of someone who wished to be noticed doing so. She did not turn. Instead, she found herself thinking of a morning 11 years distant, when her father had knelt in the wet grass of the northern field with his instruments laid out before him like surgical tools, and had told her, without looking up, that a boundary was never merely a boundary. It was an argument, he had said, that the land made with itself, and the surveyor's task was only to write down which side had won. She had not understood him then. She understood him now, watching the gavel, watching the auctioneer's fingers curl loosely around its handle. The door at the back of the hall remained shut. Whatever Blackwood had been waiting for had not arrived, and the waiting itself had begun to cost him something visible, a tightness at the jaw, a stillness in the shoulders, that was not composure, but its imitation, worn thin. He glanced once more toward the window, where the carriage drive curved away into gray sheets of weather, empty of any approaching wheel. "The bid stands," the auctioneer said, and his voice carried no triumph in it, only the flat administration of fact. "Unless there is objection made now, in this room, by a party withstanding to make it." No one moved. The gentleman in the wet greatcoat studied the toe of his boot with great attention. An older woman near the front, the vicar's wife, Rosalind thought, though she could not be certain, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, as though to keep some sound from escaping it, whether of laughter or of something gentler. Blackwood opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man, she understood suddenly, who had built his entire authority upon the assumption that no one in these rooms would ever look closely enough, or stay long enough, or care enough to challenge the shape of things as he presented them. He had not accounted for a woman who had spent childhood afternoons memorizing the exact gradient of a hillside because her father asked her to hold the chain steady and mind the numbers. The gavel rose. She became aware, in that instant, of the particular quality of the silence, not empty, but full, the way a held breath is full, and of her own heartbeat, which had gone slow and enormous, filling her ears the way distant thunder fills a valley before the storm itself arrives. Someone behind her whispered a number, the final number, as though testing whether saying it aloud might make it more true. The auctioneer's eyes found hers once, briefly, gravely, the way her father's had so often done, across a surveying field, when the numbers came out right. The gavel fell. The sound of it was smaller than she had imagined it would be, all these years of imagining. A dry, wooden knock, no louder than a door closing in a distant room of a house otherwise asleep. And yet it seemed to rearrange the air of the hall entirely, so that for a moment, nothing else in the room appeared to move. She did not move either. She had learned, long before that morning, that the body could hold itself perfectly still, even as everything within it rushed forward, the way a river runs beneath ice, without troubling the surface. "Sold," the auctioneer said, to Miss Ferrers, of the parish of Ashcombe St. Mary, for the sum stated. He did not embellish it. He did not need to. He said her name the way her father used to say the final figure of a survey, plainly, as though the truth required no ornament to be believed. Somewhere to her left, a chair scraped against the floorboards, a gentleman rising perhaps, or merely shifting his weight in disbelief, and the sound of it seemed to break whatever had held the room in its long, suspended breath. Voices returned. Not loud ones. The murmur of a crowd recovering itself was a different thing altogether from the murmur of a crowd anticipating a spectacle. This was quieter, almost embarrassed, as though the room itself had been caught staring. Blackwood had not moved from where he stood. His hand still rested upon the ledger before him, fingers spread flat across the page, as if he might, by pressure alone, will the ink to rearrange itself into some more favorable sum. When at last he looked up, it was not at her but past her, toward the door, as though he were already calculating how quickly the news might travel, and to whom, and what might yet be salvaged from the wreck of the morning. She thought, watching him, that she had expected to feel triumph, and instead felt something quieter and stranger, a kind of exhaustion that went down to the bone, the particular tiredness of a labor finally set down after being carried too long. Her hands, she noticed, had gone cold, despite the press of bodies in the room, and there was a faint tremor in them that she pressed flat against her skirts before anyone could observe it. The auctioneer was already speaking to his clerk in a low voice, something about papers, about the parish register, about the hour at which the deed might be drawn, the ordinary machinery of ownership grinding forward now that the drama of the bidding had spent itself. She heard the words without quite absorbing their weight. It seemed impossible that a house could change hands in the space of a single sentence, when it had taken her father 11 summers merely to walk its boundaries and set them down on paper. Someone touched her elbow. She turned, expecting Blackwood's cold civility, and found instead the auctioneer's clerk, holding out a pen, and behind him, framed in the doorway against the gray morning light, a man she did not recognize, dressed for travel, still brushing rain from his coat. She took the pen because it was offered, because her hand seemed to know what to do, even as her mind lagged several steps behind, still turning over the shape of the room, the faces, the particular gray light through the tall windows that had not changed at all in the hour that had changed everything else. The clerk indicated a line. She signed her name in a hand steadier than she felt, the ink catching slightly on the rough grain of the paper, and somewhere behind her she heard Blackwood's voice, pitched low, addressing no one in particular, a comment about haste, about proceedings conducted without proper notice, the words trailing off as though he had not the energy to finish them. The stranger in the doorway did not move to enter. He stood as a man stands when he has arrived somewhere he is not certain he ought to be, his hat still in his hand, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, his eyes moving once around the room, the scattered chairs, the auctioneer's table, the small knot of gentlemen already drawing on their gloves to leave, before settling, briefly, on her. She did not know him, that much was certain, but there was something in the set of his jaw, some faint architecture of feature, that struck her as familiar in the way a half-remembered melody is familiar, recognizable before it can be named. He did not approach. He seemed, if anything, to be waiting for the room to empty before he committed himself to whatever purpose had brought him through the rain. The clerk took back the pen, blotted the page, and murmured something about the register being sent to the parish by evening. The auctioneer, folding his spectacles into their case, allowed himself the smallest bow in her direction, no more than an inclination of the head, but she felt the weight of it, the years of acquaintance with her father compressed into that single small courtesy. "Miss Ferrars," he said, "the house is yours by every letter of the law that governs such things. I do not think even Mr. Blackwood would care to test it further." Blackwood, gathering his papers with more force than the task required, said nothing at all, which she understood to be its own kind of answer. It was only as she turned toward the door, meaning to step out into the wet gray morning and begin the long walk of comprehending what she had done, that she found the stranger still there, unmoved, watching her with an expression she could not yet read. Not quite hostility, not quite grief, something held very carefully in between the two. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat onto the flagstones. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to reconsider, and instead simply stepped aside to let her pass, his eyes following her the whole while, as though he were trying to fix her face in memory, before deciding what, exactly, he meant to do about her. She did not look back at him, though every instinct bred into her by years of careful walking across other men's land told her she ought to. Instead, she crossed the threshold into the wet morning, and the cold struck her face like a hand laid flat and firm, bringing with it the particular clarity that comes only after a thing long feared has finally happened and proved survivable. The gravel of the drive had gone the color of wet slate, and the elms along its edge dripped steadily, each drop finding the same worn hollow in the stone below, as though the house itself had been recording, for 100 years, exactly where the water wished to fall. She had walked this drive as a girl beside her father, his surveying rod over one shoulder, her hand curled trustingly into his coat pocket for warmth. She had walked it since as a woman alone, notebook against her ribs, learning by measured steps what the deeds could never tell her, that the northern field sloped wrong for grazing, that the stone beneath it rang differently under a dropped mallet, that men who owned land seldom troubled to understand it. Now she walked it a third time, and the gravel gave the same small protest beneath her boots as it always had, indifferent to the fact that she now owned the very ground producing the sound. Behind her, the door of the estate office opened again. She heard it, though she did not turn, the particular scrape of hinge that had not been oiled since the old lord's illness had made such domestic cares seem trivial. Footsteps followed, unhurried, deliberate, the tread of a man accustomed to being waited for, rather than waiting. She quickened her pace instinctively, though pride would not let her call it fleeing. "Miss Ferrars," his voice reached her plainly through the rain, without shelter of hat or courtesy. She stopped, because to walk on would have been its own kind of confession. He came to stand a proper distance from her, near enough for speech, far enough to satisfy whatever rule governed men of his sort. Up close, the grief she had glimpsed in the office resolved into something more particular, not sorrow for the house itself, she thought, but for some idea of it he had carried a long while, and never once tested against the actual stone and slope of the place. "You knew about the northern field," he said. "It was not quite a question. I surveyed it," she answered, "some years before it mattered to anyone." He considered this. Rain gathering along the brim of his hat and falling in a single thread past his ear. "My uncle never once mentioned a surveyor's daughter." "He had no cause to," she said. "I was never anyone he needed to remember." Something flickered across his face then, recognition perhaps, of a debt owed to people who go unremembered, before he inclined his head, turned, and walked back toward the house that was no longer his to enter uninvited. She watched him go, the rain thickening between them, until his shape blurred into the gray of the drive, and she thought, not without a certain grim amusement, that grief made even the proudest men walk like servants dismissed from a room they had believed their own. The gravel swallowed his footsteps. She did not move until the door had closed behind him, and even then she remained a moment longer beneath the dripping yew, feeling the cold work its way past her collar, because there was a kind of honesty in cold that warmth never offered, and she had learned to trust it. She walked back to the gatehouse that had become, temporarily, her lodging, and there she lit a single candle and drew out her father's ledger again, though she had read every line of it 100 times since his death. The paper had gone soft at the corners from handling. She turned to the page marked in his cramped, particular hand. Northern Boundary, Stone Bearing, 1809. And beneath it, the smaller notation she had not shown anyone, not the auctioneer, not the trustee, not even, yet, the nephew who had asked his careful half-question in the rain. A second seam, deeper than the first, running east beneath what had once been grazing land, noted only because her father had been thorough in a way that cost him nothing but time, and time, in those last years of his failing sight, had been the one thing he still possessed in abundance. She had told no one of the second seam. Not out of cunning, she was careful, in her own accounting, to distinguish the two, but because a woman who revealed the whole of her knowledge at once left herself nothing to stand upon should the first revelation be doubted, dismissed, or simply taken from her by someone with a barrister and no shame. She had watched Blackwood's face when the quarry rights were read into the record. She did not think he had missed the second notation. She thought, rather, that he had not yet understood what he was looking at, and that ignorance, in a man so certain of his own thoroughness, would not last. The candle guttered. Outside the small window, the rain had settled into that steady, windless fall, particular to the county in autumn, the kind that soaked the ground rather than beat it, and somewhere beyond the gatehouse wall she could hear the horses shifting in the old stable, restless with the change of weather. She closed the ledger and sat a while with her hand flat upon its cover, as though she might read her father's intentions through the leather itself. Tomorrow she would walk the eastern boundary again, alone, before anyone else thought to ask what lay beneath the second line he had drawn, and before the nephew's grief hardened, as grief in proud men so often did, into something closer to appetite. She woke before the servants, in that gray hour when the house still belonged to the dead man who had built it, and dressed with the practicality of someone who had learned early that grief does not excuse cold hands. The rain had not stopped in the night. It had only thinned, and the yard beyond her window lay slick and dark, the flagstones shining like the backs of eels. She took her father's rod from where it leaned against the wardrobe, worn smooth at the grip, the brass ferrule gone green at its edge, and did not trouble to wake anyone to accompany her, for she had walked this ground long before it was hers to walk, and solitude had never yet betrayed her the way company sometimes did. The eastern boundary lay beyond the orchard, past a hedge that had been let go to thorn, and she moved through it with the unhurried patience of a woman reading a page she already half knew by heart. The second notation in her father's hand had been small, almost an afterthought, tucked beneath the surveyor's mark for the quarry, a line she had once assumed referred only to drainage, until last night's ledger had shown her otherwise, water rights. Not merely the stone beneath the northern field, but the spring that fed it, and the mill 2 farms distant that depended upon that spring, without ever troubling to ask whose land it rose from. She stood at the fence line a long while, letting the rain settle on her shoulders, doing the sum in her head the way her father had taught her to do sums, slowly and twice. If she was right, the quarry was not the whole of what Blackwood's silence had been protecting. It was only the half of it visible from the road. Behind her, unannounced, a boot broke a puddle. She did not startle, though her pulse gave one hard private lurch before settling. She had grown accustomed, in 3 days, to being watched by men who believed themselves unseen. "You keep early hours for a woman who owns the deed outright," the nephew said, his coat dark with damp, his grief worn now like a garment he had not yet learned to take off in company. "The land keeps its own hours," she said. "I have only troubled to learn them." He looked past her to the fence, to the thorn hedge, to the gray smear of hill where the spring must rise, and something in his face, not cunning yet, not quite, began, slowly, to calculate. She did not warn him off. She only turned, rod in hand, and began the walk back toward the house, letting him decide for himself whether to follow, and if he did, whether he understood yet what he was following her toward. He followed. She heard it before she saw it. The particular unevenness of a gentleman's boots on ground that had never been made for gentlemen, the small catches and recoveries of a man unused to reading a field. Her father had walked this same path 100 times with his rod over his shoulder, and she had learned, long before she understood why, that the way a person crossed uneven ground told her more of their character than anything they said standing still. The nephew crossed it badly, but he crossed it, and he did not complain of the wet, and that, she allowed, was something. At the stile he paused, waiting for her to go first, an old habit of manners that sat oddly on him now, as though he had not decided whether the courtesies of his former life still applied to a woman who held the deed he had come to contest. She went over without his hand. She had gone over that stile 1,000 times before he had thought to ask its name. "You mapped this yourself," he said, not quite a question, when they reached the rise where the ground dropped toward the northern boundary, the whole of it. "With my father," he held the chain. "I read the angles." She did not look at him when she said it. He trusted numbers more than he trusted men, toward the end. I have found no reason since to think him wrong. He absorbed that in silence, the kind of silence she had come to recognize as a man revising, privately, some sentence he had already prepared before he arrived. Blackwood's letters, she suspected, had furnished him with a very different woman than the one now walking ahead of him with a surveying rod, resting easy across her shoulder, as though it weighed nothing at all. "My uncle never mentioned a survey," he said. "Your uncle never asked to see it." She let that settle, before she added, more gently than the words required. "He asked me instead whether the roof would hold through another winter. I told him the truth. It was the only thing I ever gave him, that Mr. Blackwood did not have a hand in first." The nephew's jaw tightened, not at her, she thought, but at some private accounting of his own, of letters unanswered, of a great-uncle grown old and unvisited, while a stranger's daughter walked his boundaries with a chain and a level and no complaint. Grief, she was learning, made honest men slower to anger than dishonest ones, because it left them too occupied with what they had lost to spend much feeling on what they had failed to gain. She did not offer him comfort. She had none to spare that was not already promised to the land itself. She only slowed her pace very slightly, so that he might keep beside her rather than behind, and let the house come into view above the hedgerow, chimneys pale against a sky not yet decided on rain. They came upon the hedgerow gap where the drive turned, and he stopped there as though the house itself had put out a hand to halt him. She had seen the effect before, visitors who thought themselves prepared by rumor of decline, and found the decline more particular than they had imagined. The east wing's windows were shuttered still, 3 of them, for want of glass her father had once priced at 11 shillings the pane, and never found the 11 shillings. The drive itself had gone to moss in patches, soft and green as a bruise, and the gravel that remained crunched thin under their boots, more dust than stone. "It wants work," he said. "It wants money," she said. "Work I have already given it." He looked at her then, with an attention she recognized, the particular stillness of a man recalculating a figure he had thought settled. She did not enjoy it as triumph. She had wanted, for a long while now, only to be seen accurately, and accuracy, she had found, rarely announced itself with satisfaction. It arrived instead like this, quietly, in a hedgerow gap, with a stranger's jaw working at some sum he had not thought to check before. They went on. The house grew larger, the way houses do, when approached on foot rather than by carriage, not grander, but more honest, its faults visible at a scale a coach window would have softened. She watched him note the sagging lead of the west gutter, the ivy that had begun to work its fingers under the sill of the library window. She had noted these things herself 100 times, in the ledger she kept by lamplight, in the small hours when the arithmetic of repair against income refused to balance, and she balanced it anyway, by will, the way her father had taught her to true a chain over uneven ground, not by wishing the ground were level, but by accounting, precisely, for how far it was not. At the door, the housekeeper had left it ajar against the coming weather, and the smell that met them was tallow and old wood smoke and, faintly, the beeswax she used on the hall table, because lavender polish was dearer and did the same work. He paused on the threshold as a man pauses at a church door he has not entered in some years. Not from piety, she thought, but from the sudden weight of what a threshold represents once a person is old enough to have crossed a great many of them badly. "You've kept it standing," he said, and there was no condescension in it now, only the flat wonder of a debt recognized late. "I have kept it honest," she said. Standing was never in question, only who would pay for it, and on what terms. She did not invite him further than the hall, not yet. She set down her father's chain bag by the door, where it always went, and waited to see what he would ask for next. He did not ask for anything at once. He looked instead at the low ceiling with its water stain shaped, if one squinted, like a running hare. At the umbrella stand that held no umbrellas but 3 walking sticks, one of them her father's, worn smooth at the grip where a man's palm had pressed against it for 30 years of uneven fields. He looked the way a person looks at a room he has been told about but never permitted to enter, cataloging it against some private ledger of his own, and finding, perhaps, that the sums did not match what he had been given to expect. "There was a portrait," he said finally, "in the long gallery, a woman in blue holding a hawk." "There was," she said. "There is not, now. It was sold in the 2nd year, when the roof over the east wing gave way and had to be reslated before winter. I kept the frame. The canvas was too far gone with damp to be worth keeping, and I could not afford to be sentimental about cloth when the alternative was a wet attic." He absorbed this the way a man absorbs a fact he cannot quite dispute and does not wish to praise aloud. "You sold my family's portraits to mend a roof. I sold what was mine to sell, to mend what was mine to keep standing. The distinction matters more to a solicitor than to Rain." She said it without heat. She had long since stopped expecting him to find the arithmetic comfortable. She asked only that he find it accurate. A silence followed, not unfriendly, but full, the kind that comes when a man is recalculating a story he has told himself for years, and finding the new figures inconvenient but not, quite, deniable. Outside, the wind had shifted, and brought with it the smell of wet stone from the quarry road, a smell she had known since girlhood, and had long ago stopped noticing, until a stranger's presence made her notice everything again, the way a house looks different the first time it is shown to someone who might judge it. "The chain bag," he said, glancing at it where it sat by the door. "Your father's?" "Mine, now. He taught me to read it before he taught me to write my own name properly. Said a name could wait, but a boundary line, if you got it wrong once, might cost a man his field for a generation." She met his eyes. "I have not gotten one wrong yet." He said nothing to that, but something in his face, not softening, not quite, but loosening, as ice on a pond loosens before it is honest enough to call itself water, told her he had understood. It was not a boast. It was a fact, offered the way she offered all her facts, plainly, and because he had, at last, asked the right question. He did not press further that afternoon, though she saw the question sitting behind his eyes, the way a debt sits behind a polite smile, unspoken, but not forgotten. Instead he asked, with the careful neutrality of a man testing ice before he puts his weight upon it, whether the survey notes extended past the northern boundary, into the ground his uncle's man of business had always dismissed as barren. "They extend as far as my father walked," she said, which was most of it, in 30 years. She did not say, "and further than your uncle ever troubled to," though the thought moved through her plainly enough that she suspected he read it in her face regardless. He had that manner of listening, not the listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the listening of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and only now discovering the strange, humbling pleasure of being informed instead. The housekeeper brought in the second pot of tea without being asked, and set it down with a look that lingered a half-second too long on the gentleman's boots, still dusty from the road, still unbrushed, a small vanity he had evidently not thought to attend to, or had thought beneath attending to, which amounted in that house to the same offense. Rosalind noticed the look and said nothing, but poured his cup herself, which was its own quiet correction, delivered in China rather than words. "You will forgive me," he said at last, "if I ask what my uncle's man, Blackwood, told you of the quarry rights before the sale." He told me nothing of them, she said. He did not think me worth telling. A silence followed this, that was not, this time, the silence of a man deciding what to believe, but the silence of a man arriving somewhere he had not expected to arrive, a recognition, perhaps, that his uncle's estate had been managed for years by a person who withheld information as a matter of habit, and that he himself, standing now in the borrowed dignity of the drawing room, was only the latest man to have been kept comfortably in the dark. He set his cup down with more care than the moment strictly required. "Then I find myself," he said slowly, "in the curious position of asking a stranger to tell me what my own family's man of business did not think fit to share. You are not a stranger to the land," she said. "Only to what it is worth. That is easily mended, if you are willing to walk it." Outside, the light had begun its slow decline toward evening, gilding the wet stone of the yard, and somewhere beyond the window, the quarry road waited, patient as it had always been, for someone at last to ask it the right question. He rose from his chair with the particular stiffness of a man who has spent the last fortnight on coach roads and worse company, and she found herself measuring him as she had once measured her father's clients, not for what he claimed to be, but for what his boots and his patience told her he was. His boots were good but not new. His patience, she noted, had lasted longer than most gentlemen's, who generally began to fidget the moment a woman spoke of surveys and elevations, rather than of weather and health. "Now," she said, "if you mean to walk it." "I mean to walk it," he said, though I confess I had pictured this conversation differently. On the coach from London, I had pictured a good deal of unpleasantness, possibly weeping, possibly a solicitor. "There is a solicitor," she said. "He drew up the deed. He is a friend of my father's, and he will tell you, if you ask him plainly, that everything done was done within the letter of the law, however little it pleased Mr. Blackwood's client to hear it. I am beginning to understand," he said, "that I was that client in name only. I gave instructions from a distance, and trusted a man I ought not to have trusted, and I have paid the ordinary price of laziness, dressed up as delegation." He said this without bitterness, which surprised her more than if he had shouted it. My uncle did the same, I think, in his own way. Trusted the wrong man to tell him the truth about his own fields. She did not contradict him. It was, after all, a fair accounting, and she had long since learned that the fastest way to lose a man's respect was to correct him when he had already corrected himself. They went out through the side door rather than the front, past the kitchen garden where the last of the beans hung brown and papery on their stakes, and up the rise toward the northern boundary where the ground grew stony beneath the grass. The evening smelled of wood smoke and wet chalk. He walked with his hands clasped behind him, in the manner of a man unused to walking anywhere without a destination announced in advance, and twice he stumbled on the uneven turf before he learned to watch his feet as she did, from long habit, without seeming to watch them at all. At the crest of the field she stopped, and pointed, and said nothing further, because the ground itself, pale and cracked where the plough had worn thin the soil, was already beginning to say what her father's notes had said for 11 years, that beneath the grass lay something no one in this family had ever thought to look for. He crouched, at last, and put his hand flat against the exposed stone, as though the gesture might tell him something his eyes could not, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. A rook called somewhere behind them, and the sound carried strangely across the open field, thin and interrupted, the way sound travels when the air has gone cold enough to hold it. She watched him turn a fragment of chalk over in his fingers, watched him note, because he was not a stupid man, whatever else he was, the faint gray seam running beneath the white, the line that did not belong to chalk at all, but to something harder, something that had waited under this particular field since long before either of their families had claimed it. "My uncle never came up here," he said. It was not quite a question, and she did not answer it as one. "He rode the southern boundary twice a year, with the steward, and considered the estate accounted for," she said. "The northern field was let for grazing, and thought of as poor ground. No one asked why the grass grew thin here, or why the frost took longer to leave it in March. And your father asked." "My father asked everything. It was, I believe, considered a fault in him, by the sort of men who prefer their land, to answer only the questions they think to put to it. He did not respond to that at once, and she let the silence stand, because she had learned, from the auction room, from the solicitor's office, from a dozen rooms in which men had weighed her worth and found it wanting before she opened her mouth, that silence pressed harder than argument ever could. He straightened, finally, brushing the chalk dust from his palm against his coat without seeming to notice he had done it, and looked not at the ground but at her, with an expression she could not immediately name because she had not yet seen it on his face, something closer to reckoning than to surprise. "You might have told Blackwood," he said, "at the sale. You might have let him bid it up on the strength of it, and taken the profit from the difference." "I might have," she agreed, "but I wanted the land, not the difference. There is a distinction, though I find gentlemen rarely trouble themselves to make it." The wind came up then, carrying the smell of the far woods with it, and he said nothing further, only stood a while longer with his eyes on the seam of gray stone, as though counting, for the first time, the cost of everything his family had failed for 11 years to see. They walked back toward the house in a silence that had changed shape, though neither of them remarked upon it, and it was Mrs. Hale who broke it, appearing at the kitchen door with a look that suggested she had been watching the field through the scullery window for the better part of an hour. "There's tea," she said, "if the gentleman means to stay for it," and the way she said "gentleman" carried a faint edge, not of hostility exactly, but of a woman reserving her judgment until the evidence had finished presenting itself. He said he would stay, if it were not an imposition, and Mrs. Hale replied that the house had survived worse impositions than one more cup poured, and went back inside without waiting for an answer. The parlor had not changed since her father's day beyond the addition of the surveying rod above the hearth, and she saw him notice it, saw his eyes go to the brass fittings, worn smooth at the grip, and linger there a moment before he took the chair she offered him. He did not ask about it. She did not explain it. There are objects, she had learned, that explain themselves to anyone patient enough to look, and rush their meaning to no one else. "Your solicitor's letter," he said, once the tea had been poured, and Mrs. Hale had withdrawn with the particular briskness of a woman who intends to remain within earshot. "It named a figure for the disputed quarter." "It did. It was lower than the land will earn in a single season, once the rights are properly let." "I am aware." He turned the cup in his hands without drinking from it. "Then why offer it at all?" "Because I did not wish to own the whole of what your family lost," she said. "Only the part your uncle deeded fairly, before the debts turned him careless. There is a difference between a bargain and a theft, sir, and I have no taste for profiting by the second, merely because the law would permit it." She watched this settle in him the way water settles into dry ground, slowly, and without visible effect at first. "You may take the figure to your own solicitor and have him tell you it is fair. I expect he will." "I expect he will too," he said, which is a strange thing to find disappointing. He said it without bitterness, almost as a man remarking on weather he had not thought to dress for, and set the cup down on its saucer with a small, deliberate click. "I had come prepared to find you grasping, Miss Ferrars. I confess I do not know what to do with the alternative." "You might," she said, "simply drink your tea before it goes cold. Gentlemen so rarely think of that either." He did drink it, then, though he did so slowly, as a man testing whether the warmth would do what conversation could not. The parlor had gone quiet in the particular way rooms do after a hard thing has been said honestly, the fire ticking in the grate, rain beginning again against the glass with no great urgency, only a patient tapping that seemed content to continue all afternoon. She watched him over the rim of her own cup, and thought that he had his uncle's jaw, but none of his uncle's ease in a chair, as though he had spent his whole life sitting in rooms that did not belong to him, and had never quite learned to occupy one as though it might. "You said there was a survey," he said at last. "My uncle's, or your father's. I confess I no longer know which name to put to it. Both, in a manner of speaking. My father walked the boundary in the spring of 1809, when your uncle still believed the northern field good for nothing but sheep and complaint. I have his notes. I have kept them better than I have kept most things. I should like to see them." It was not a demand, though it carried something of the old family habit of assuming a thing would be produced upon asking. She let the silence stretch a breath longer than courtesy required, not from unkindness but from the simple wish to see whether he would notice the asking and correct it. He did. "If you would permit it," he added, quieter, and something in his face suggested the correction cost him more than the tea had. "I will fetch them," she said, and rose. The notebook was where it had always been, in the leather satchel that had once ridden her father's shoulder across 3 counties of chalk and clay, its corners softened by handling, the ink in places gone, the color of weak tea itself. She brought it to him, and did not hover while he opened it, though she watched his hands, careful hands, she noted, for a man who had grown up being served rather than serving, turn the pages with the particular gentleness of someone who understood, without being told, that the paper was older than any claim he might make upon it. He stopped at a page marked in her father's cramped, exacting hand, a diagram of strata and depth, dated and initialed in the corner the way her father had always insisted, believing that a measurement without a date was no measurement at all, only a guess, dressed respectably. He was thorough, he said. He was afraid of being wrong, she said. It comes to the same thing, in a surveyor. He looked up at her then, and for a long moment neither of them reached for the teacups, nor for anything to say, the rain filling the space where words might otherwise have gone. It was he who broke the silence first, though not with the question she had braced for. "Why did no one else see it?" he asked, and there was no accusation in the words, only the particular bewilderment of a man discovering that the world had been arranged differently than he had been told. "Because no one else walked it," she said. "Your uncle's men rode the boundary in an afternoon and called it a survey. My father walked it for 11 days, in October, in weather no sensible man would choose, because the light was low enough to show him the shadow lines in the northern field, where the grass grew thin over stone that lay close beneath the soil. She did not say it to wound him, though it did, she saw, wound him a little, the way truth wounds when it arrives too late to be useful. He closed the satchel with the same care he had opened it, and set his hand flat upon the leather, not gripping it, only resting there, as a man might rest his hand on a door he had not yet decided whether to knock upon. "My uncle never mentioned him," he said. "Your father, I mean. In all the years I might have asked." "He wasn't the sort of man Dukes mentioned," she said, without bitterness, though the words carried the weight of a great many afternoons spent watching her father fold his measuring chain, with hands too swollen to close properly, unremembered by the house whose bones he had known better than its own family. The rain had softened to a patter against the glass, and somewhere below, a servant's footsteps crossed the hall, unhurried, the ordinary sounds of a house, continuing to be a house regardless of what passed in its upper rooms. "I did not come today to ask forgiveness," he said at last, and she noted that he had not touched the teacup at all, that it sat cooling, untouched at his elbow, steam long since given up. "I came to see the survey. I find I have come away wanting something else instead." He did not say what, and she did not ask him to name it, understanding that some things were better left unspoken a while longer, the way a wound is better left unbandaged until one is certain it has stopped bleeding. Outside, the last of the rain gave way to a thin gray light over the northern field, where the stone still lay beneath the grass, exactly where her father had marked it, patient, unclaimed, waiting the better part of 2 decades to be believed. He rose then, as though the rising itself cost him something he had not budgeted for, and crossed to the window where the light lay thinnest, and stood looking out at the field, the way a man looks at a debt he has finally consented to read in full. She watched him from her chair, the survey still open on her knee, her father's hand visible in every faded line of ink, and she thought how strange it was that the paper had outlasted the man who made it, had outlasted also the pride of the one who had scorned it, and would very likely outlast them both besides. "You will find the eastern boundary runs shorter than the old deed claims," she said, not unkindly, for there was no unkindness left in her toward him, only the settled quiet of a woman who has already won, and need not press the point. "My father noted the error in 19, no one troubled to correct it until now." He turned from the window, No one troubled to ask him. No, she agreed, they did not. He did not stay much longer. There was a bow, correctly made, and a request, offered rather than demanded, which she marked as a small alteration in the grammar of the house, that he might call again to see how the quarrying proceeded, once the surveyors from Bristol had done their work. She said he might, and meant it, and understood that this was not forgiveness exactly, nor yet its opposite, but something narrower and more honest, the beginning of an acquaintance between equals, which neither his blood nor her want of it could now unmake. By the following Michaelmas, the quarry was letting stone to 3 counties, and the house wore a new roof paid for by rock her father had marked, and no one had believed, and the trustee's name was spoken in the village, with the particular flatness reserved for men who had once been feared, and were feared no longer. She kept the ledgers herself. She kept, too, her father's surveying rod, its brass fittings gone the soft color of old coin, mounted above the hearth in the room where the old lord had used to sit of an evening, with his port and his complaints against a world that had never troubled to measure him accurately. Visitors sometimes asked why a woman of property kept so plain a thing in so prominent a place. She never explained it fully. She only said that a house ought to remember who had first taken the true measure of it, and let them wonder, as she once had, what exactly that measuring had cost, and what it had, in the end, so quietly